Good evening. Welcome to the Bible Speaks Today from LBC Television Ministries. If I looked a little bit like the deer in the headlights, I was getting a last-minute briefing from the floor manager, cameraman, general factotum who sits out there in front of everything. And I was so busy watching what he was saying or listening to what he was saying, because I'm very obedient, I forgot the credits had rolled. Okay, it's the last day of December, I think you're seeing this. For December 31st, and I hope you are seeing it. As I said last week's program, that over the Christmas period, the cable board of Kentucky that we broadcast these through and from them onto your cable network does usually have a lot of other Christmas programs, and occasionally we get preempted. I don't know why. I thought perhaps we had some standing with them, but occasionally we do. So if you don't get this one until January, like the 5th of January, 2nd of January, then understand that it was designed to go out on the 31st of December. And I hope that all of you have had a very merry Christmas and a very holy Christmas as well, that you've not forgotten to remember the reason we celebrate Christmas before you go out and do all your merrymaking and lights at the zoo and skating on the river, or God forbid we should do that this year. But you know, hopefully it won't be that cold. It'd be nice if it snowed. If it had snowed, it would be nice. I think my wife and I, quite often are not in Kentucky for Christmas. We tend to visit the main family, who, luckily for us, live mostly in Phoenix, Arizona, which means around either just before Christmas or in some cases immediately after Christmas Day, we trot off to the warmth and the sunny skies of Arizona and celebrate the week of Christmas, New Year, etc. there. This year, we're going to stick it out and stay here. So I'm hoping for perhaps a white Christmas, but not a freezing cold one. And before we go any further, I want to say a thank you on air, or whatever they say on air, on video, to the people in the back room here and the people in the studio in front of me who do so much work to make this happen. What I do is research some information and sit here and tell you about it. They do all the technical work, the setting up and the setting down and the focusing and sets. You can't believe the things they have me do before the program to get it just right. And of course, the technical stuff. There's a chap running sound back there, another chap running video. They do a lot of work, and they don't just do it for these programs. They do it for all our programs. It's the same people. It's not like we've got like an A crew and a B crew. That would be nice, but we have the same people every Tuesday, nearly every Tuesday of every week in the year. They're here, helping to record these programs that you see. So you might remember them in your prayers this year, or any time of the year, okay? What we've done over Christmas, of course, if we've been to church, and I hope we have, is had the what we call the infancy narratives found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Kind of funny that Mark doesn't say much about it, does it? John assumes that we know about it. You ever thought about that? John doesn't say a word about the infancy of Christ. He does one or two words, but not very much. Mark doesn't say very much. Okay? But Matthew and Luke go into it in detail. And really, when you think about the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is what we believe, it rests upon events in Bethlehem when Christ was born. And you can't say, oh, well, that's not the most important thing. Well, think about it. If he hadn't been born, he wouldn't have preached, he wouldn't have been crucified, he wouldn't have risen again, and we would have nothing to believe. So the birth of Christ, whilst it's a Christmas and it's a time to celebrate and that sort of thing, it is still the very hinge point of our faith. And I think our understanding of the identity of Jesus Christ is in those infancy narratives. I think most of us have confidence in the fact that Matthew and Luke give us truthful accounts of the events surrounding the birth of Christ. Now, I agree they may have been constrained and and things have been truncated so they fit into a narrative. That's common practice back in those days. But the major events all are important steps and part of our belief. And a closer look at some of these is what we're going to do now. A closer look at some of these events in the narrative. You might find some details that because they're so familiar to us, that you don't notice them. You know, it's like if you know a song or a pop song, or you know a story so well you've read it 20, 30 times, and sometimes you read it again and suddenly you notice a paragraph or a sentence or an expression of speech that you hadn't picked up on before, which gives a whole new enlightening meaning to that piece. I mean, Matthew, for example, he begins with the genealogy of Jesus, demonstrating the sequence of generations as Israel anticipates the birth of David's son. Now, Israel as a whole weren't sitting down on that date in 6 BC or 5 BC or 3 AD or 1 AD or 0, whatever particular date you choose to hang your hat on for the birth of Christ. They weren't sitting around waiting for the Messiah. They knew he was coming, but nobody had said it's this year or next year or last year or whatever. Okay? But what Matthew does is set the genealogy so that people can see why it was this year. It's a point to think about. Luke, of course, wants to set out an orderly account, and that's kind of interesting what Luke says about an orderly account. Now, Luke's supposed to be a physician. I'm not saying he wasn't. Luke's, by tradition, a physician who would be, presumably, have an orderly mind, you know, writing things down in an orderly fashion. And I think perhaps Luke was familiar with Mark's Gospel, and Matthew's possibly, but certainly Mark's Gospel. And Mark's Gospel, if you read it, is one headlong helter-skelter. We went there, straightway we did this, then we did this and that and that and that and that. I mean, Mark's running at full speed throughout his Gospel. Luke would have probably looked at that and said, "Ooh, you know, we need a more, you know, fill it in. There's more details here." And so he says at the beginning of his introduction, you know, a more orderly account. So let's go back a bit. He records the anticipation of the birth of John the Baptist, a whole bunch of information. Now you could say, from Matthew or Mark's point of view, well, they don't need to know that. I mean, that's part of the history. You know, we need to know what happened at the birth. But Luke very carefully sketches in all the backgrounds. Like Joe Friday used to say, give me the facts, just the facts, okay? And so he talks about the anticipation of the birth of John the Baptist, which was anticipated. You remember his parents and his mother Elizabeth? Okay, then he moves on to tell the story of the virgin conception of Christ. A very careful wording there, because that particular line of belief was still pretty new when Luke wrote it down. And in fact, the acceptance of the virgin birth wasn't really common acceptance, if you will, until 2nd or 3rd century Christianity. They didn't care much about it in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Okay? So a careful reading of Matthew and Luke reveals a tremendous amount of detail, and at the same time this grand expanse of the story of Christ's birth, and a much more grander event than perhaps Mark or somebody put onto it. Matthew, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, if you accept the tradition that Matthew, being a Jew, whether he was a tax collector or a Levi or whatever he was, Matthew, being a Jew, wrote for the Jewish consumption. In other words, he wrote the story of Christ in words that the average Jew who had studied the Torah, the Talmud, whatever, and would understand what his references were. And he pays particular attention to the fulfillments of the Old Testament prophecy. And Matthew goes into big detail on this. If you look at a Bible, you know, one of these ones that has all the references and everything with it, Schofield or somebody like that, where you read Matthew, under each of these verses in the narrative in the birth narratives, Matthew's got a whole bunch of, see Isaiah, see this, see that, see that, see that, see that, as backup references. I mean, the virgin birth is in there. In Isaiah, and behold, a young woman. Okay, the birth of Christ in Bethlehem of Judea. There's 2 Bethlehems. Don't forget. Did you know that? Oh, there's 2. Now here's your homework. Go find out where the other one was. It's there. Okay. The massacre of the innocents by Herod. All Old Testament prophecies. Okay. The flight to Egypt. And here's something. We tend to forget how close to Egypt Israel is, even back then. Okay? People think that when the flight to Egypt, that Joseph and Mary were on the trail for a month. Well, of course, they might have been. It was slow going. But Egypt is the next country. So they just slipped across the border, basically. Okay? And why they slipped across the border, of course, to avoid the persecution, the systematic slaughter that Herod promised. More of that later. Okay. The role of John the Baptist as the forerunner of Christ, all presented as fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. We think that the narrative in the New Testament is all there is about Jesus' early days, but in fact the Old Testament points very directly towards Christ. Now, I'll be honest, the notes and the program we're doing tonight is a repeat of a program I did some time ago on this, but I thought for this particular time of the year it would be a good thing to go back and look at it, in case you think you've heard that before, and you probably have. I'm not above repeating myself. The Old Testament points directly to Christ. In fact, he's not only the fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecies concerning him, and there are few, obviously, he's the perfect fulfillment of what the Jews called the law and the prophets. In fact, the whole of the Old Testament scriptures. Now, that's a big statement to make. And in fact, we Christians tend to think of the Old Testament as the book of the Jews and the New Testament as the book of the Christians. And nothing could be further from the truth. It's sometimes quite a surprise to me to find that a large majority of pastors do not preach much from the Old Testament. I mean, they go into it from time to time, but most of their stuff is from the New Testament. And really, the Old Testament, the Old Testament and New Testament, to my mind, are one and the same. You can't say, oh, well, that's stuff that doesn't matter to us, and this is stuff that does. Because in the New Testament is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. And if you want to understand the power of God's will, there's much more of it in the Old Testament than there is in the New. Well, it's bigger, there's more of it for a start. But if you want to understand the frailty of men and women and how we fall away from God and come back to him and fall away and come back to him, then the Old Testament's definitely your book. Okay? One of the things to remember is that the Old Testament, the Christmas story doesn't begin in Bethlehem. It doesn't begin with the Mary's visitation from the angel Gabriel. It doesn't begin with Elizabeth's conception of John. It begins in the Old Testament because Israel had been promised a Messiah. I mean, Luke has this wonderful scene where Jesus, the baby Jesus, is taken to the temple. We don't read that very much in our birth narratives because it's later on and we're into something else by then. But Jesus is taken to the temple, and Simon recognizes and understands this infant to be the Lord's Christ, the Davidic Messiah. It's amazing that Simon would recognize the child of divine perception, I suppose. But Simon understood this clearly, that the Christmas story didn't begin in Bethlehem. It didn't even begin in Jerusalem. So you might ask, well, where does the Christmas story begin? Well, I'll tell you where it begins. You need to go to John's Gospel and read this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Now, I know that's kind of hard. If you read that in the Message Bible, it makes a bit more sense. The prologue to John's Gospel points to creation and to Christ as the agent of creation. Now, we're going to get into the Trinity, you know, the three gods in one, God the Father, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. But with language, you have to understand, John's Gospel comes straight out of Genesis. In the beginning. In other words, the Christmas story begins before the creation of the world. If God is omnipotent, all-knowing, all-deciding, is, was, and always will be, then everything that has happened to date was already known beforehand. So the whole Bethlehem story, and then what the New Testament, as we call it, was already known before the earth was created. So Christmas, the idea of Christmas, the birth of Christ, goes back to the creation of the world. Sobering thought, if you think about it. And we celebrate Christmas, and we celebrate the Christmas story, and we tie up, you know, with all the wise men going to Bethlehem, and the shepherds in the fields, and the cow and the lamb and the donkey, or whatever your crib scene has in it, the camels. We do know camels were there. We know that one, all right? But as we celebrate that, we must be careful not to focus on the fact and begin the story in Bethlehem. As I said earlier, nor even in Nazareth, where Mary was confronted with Gabriel with the message that she would be the mother of the Messiah. You can't even start it there. You can't even start it with Moses and the prophets, who had this expectation of the coming of the Son of Man, that this promised suffering servant and the heralded, you know, the Davidic Messiah. We must begin before the world was created and before humanity was formed, much less fallen away. So you say, all right, Tone, you know, that's fine. I can see the guys in the control room now with furrowed brows going, so, what's the big deal, you know? Well, why is it so important? Well, it's this. If we get the Christmas story wrong, I'll repeat that, if we get the Christmas story wrong, we get the gospel wrong. We get the gospel wrong. Because if you tell the Christmas story carelessly, offhand, you know, yeah, it's a Christmas story, you know, it sounds like God's plan B. In other words, what we're saying is we make the Christmas story sound God's thinking, oh, well, that didn't work, I'll have to do plan B. Like God's turning to a new plan, rather than fulfilling all that he had promised. Oh, well, they've fallen away, they're a pretty bad bunch, I guess I better do something else. Okay? And there was no plan B, or there is no plan B. The plan is the plan. It's been the same plan since beginning of time. We must be very careful to tell the Christmas story in such a way that we make the gospel very clear. Christmas is not God's second plan. And people tend to think it about that way. Yeah, he gave the covenant to Abraham and Isaac and all those people, and they screwed up and made a mess of it, and the Jews went crazy on formulaic religion and made all these rules and regulations, and then they fell away, and so God had to do something else. Not a bit of it. Christmas is not God's second plan. Before God created the world, this is a difficult concept, but God determined to save sinners through the blood of his own Son. And the grand narrative of the whole Bible, not just the Old Testament or the New Testament, points to this essential truth. It's something that we don't think about very much. And I must admit, for many years, I kind of considered, the Christmas story as God's second plan. Okay, that didn't work, so let's try something else. Which then, for unbelievers, says, well, that didn't work either, so we're going to try plan C, whatever that might be. The whole narrative in the Bible points to this one essential truth. God determined to bring glory to himself through the salvation of a people redeemed and purchased by his own Son. Bethlehem, Calvary, all the other things tied up with the Christmas story and the story of Christ's life on earth were essential parts of God's plan from the beginning. Before even the cosmos, the universe, whatever, was brought into being, as the Son obeyed the will of the Father from creation in creation. The Christmas story doesn't begin in Bethlehem, but we appropriately look to Bethlehem as the scene of what might be the most decisive event in human history, the incarnation of the Son of God. But even when we turn our attention to Bethlehem for that one reason, we've got to remember that the story of our salvation doesn't begin there. The story of our salvation begins with the eternal purpose of God. God's eternal plan, God's from day one, whatever day one was. Bethlehem, the Christmas story, is part of that. All the foregoing events, all the prophets and the events during the Old Testament, the wars and the battles and the bad times and the good times and the captivity in Babylon and all the rest of that, all part of that plan. And yes, at the time, people couldn't see it. When the Jews went into captivity, they would bewail and said, how can God desert us like this? And when they came back out again, they said, oh, look at us, we're ruined. How are we going to start again? And they did. When they were conquered by the Romans, how are we going to endure this? All is lost. Nobody's going to save us now. But they endured, and it was part of that plan. Go back to John's original statement. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. In other words, Jesus was God in the very beginning. And that is where the Christmas story begins. And John goes right from there. John doesn't mince matters. John goes from that statement, Jesus is God, was with God in the beginning, has always been, will always be in the future. John jumps right from that to the essence of what happened in Bethlehem. And the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. And we have seen his glory as of the only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. That's all John says. And we've seen his glory. So, Christmas is gone. We've got the new year to face. But when we next celebrate Christmas, hopefully I'm here to celebrate it with you, let's be sure that we get the Christmas story right. From start to finish. Starting not in Bethlehem, not in Jerusalem, not in Nazareth, not in Jericho or anywhere, but back before anything happened. Okay? Okay, well, we've got a couple of minutes left in this program, and this is the last program of 2014. So first of all, I want to thank you, those of you who watch on a regular basis, and for those of you who send me emails or stop me in the street or in the store and make comments, complimentary comments. I do appreciate that. I also appreciate the people who say, I don't agree with you, or I think you're wrong on that, because that tends to make me do more research, find out what's going on, this sort of thing. And as always, please don't be afraid to comment. If you have something to say about the programs, you would like to see a program about something. Some people stop me and say, why don't you ever do this? And of course, by the time I've got home, I've forgotten what it was they said. So drop me a line and an email and say, look, why don't you talk about this? Why don't you talk about that? Or I'd like to know more about this or more about that. And in 2015, we'll see what we can do. I have not planned a series of programs for 2015. I tend to leave that, like, as my wife says, I'm a procrastinator to the nth degree. I tend to wait until it happens and then start planning. I tend to get more, the juices seem to flow better. But in 2015, LBC television will still be here, the Bible Speaks will still be here, and we will still be trying to bring you information, ideas, discussions that will, first of all, encourage you to read your Bible. That is the sole purpose of this program, encouraging you to open that Bible, that story of God's plan for us, and read it, not just as an exercise in reading the Bible through one verse each day or whatever it is you do, but reading it and getting out of it more than you got out of it before, all right? So, a very happy new year to you. I hope all your dreams come true. I wish everyone's dreams came true. And I'll see you back here the first week in January. And until then, keep your Bibles handy. Good night and God bless.